Okay. Hey guys, I hope you all are doing good. In the next few videos, we're going to be covering some very simple questions based on arrays, right? These are important in my opinion because I think they will form like a basic foundation for you guys, right? We covered a few questions in the last video as well, but we will look at a bit more complicated, but they're not really complicated at all. In lead code, this wouldn't even be considered like easy level, but still I think this would form like a foundation, like a basis for how you solve lead code type questions, right? So I want to start very slow, give you guys a basic idea of how we do it, and then we will get into detail, right? The main part for doing these questions is I want to explain how to approach these type of problems. So whenever you come across like more complicated problems, how would you approach them? How do you build those problems, and how do you solve it, right? Okay. Once again, practice is what's super important. We are solving questions now. So my suggestion would be I've given this question on a board, right? I would suggest that you first of all try to pause the video and then write a simple C code, which you take an integer array and then you try to print the average of its elements, right? It could be anything. It doesn't matter that the array is given or not. Just try to print the average of an integer array. Okay, so if you wrote a C code and you were able to print it, that's pretty good. That's pretty nice. But now I will try to show you how to approach this problem, and then I'll explain the code as well, right? So first of all, let's talk about what's been given, right? Given an integer array, print the average of its elements. What do I mean by average again? Let's say I have this ARR, right? Point is, I need to print the average of its elements. Now, what is average again? That means sum all the elements up and then whatever the number of elements is divided by that, right? So, first of all, in this type of question, I need to understand what exactly is the average code, right? Or I should say, what is the average function? How do we compute it in the first place? So, average is equal to sum of elements divided by number of elements, right? This is very basic stuff. Now, instead of average, you could be asked about calculate the mean or maybe something else, right? So some very basic stuff, some these type of very basic calculations, you should know how to do them, right? So so I figured out what is the calculation of an average, right? What we are trying to do is, in order to sum the average or print the average, I first of all need to sum all the elements, and then I need to divide it by the number of elements, right? That would give me what is the average of all those elements. So how do we do it exactly? Now, this is no longer like just thinking part, right? You need to understand how exactly you would do it in the C code. So if you remember, we can use a for loop, right? We start with a for loop, but exactly how do we do it? Maybe I should do something like this, right? I create a loop which starts at my first element, right? It adds it to the second, then to the third, then to the fourth, then to the fifth. But how exactly do I do it? Now think about this. How exactly would you sum it, right? How would you start this approach? How would you start the question? In my personal opinion, I think it's best. Maybe we should declare like a sum variable, right? Maybe some kind of an int sum equals 0. So what I would do is, maybe like my personal suggestion would be, I should create like a sum integer, and I should keep on adding these values to this sum, right? So that would give me the sum of the elements part for this equation. Now I need the number of elements parts, but this is very easy to understand, right? How would you figure out how many number of elements are there in an array? Think about it, right? It would simply be just the length of the array, right? So whatever the array dot, I should say, whatever the length of the array is, you can just divide it by that. So how would you approach this type of a question? How would you write the answer? This is very simple, right? First, I declare a int sum equals 0, right? Then Okay, so let's try to understand this part, right? What exactly I'm doing? I've created this for loop. I'm going until the end. Let's say n number of elements is already given to us, right? So we don't have to calculate on our own or use an existing function. So we sum it, right? Very simple code. Just to create a for loop, sum all the values in the array. And then once we are done, at the end, we would have the sum of all the elements, right? So average would be, int average would be equal to sum divided by whatever the number of elements are, or so I should say n. And this exactly would be the answer to the question, right? So I hope that makes sense. Okay, one more quick question would be, what is the time complexity and what is the space complexity? Okay, I want you guys to pause the video and try to understand what would be the time complexity according to you and what would be the space complexity as well. Okay, so let's try to understand, right? Now, from now on, whatever questions I cover, I'll try my best to also tell about their time complexity and their space complexity, right? Because this will give us a foundation for the more complicated questions that we come across, right? This is just the very beginning. Not to scare you guys, but we're gonna go through some very complicated questions or logic as well. But these foundations are going to be super important down the way. Okay. So just a quick summary once again. Given an integer array, we are supposed to print the average of the elements. So what the first thing I need to know is, how do I calculate the average? What is the average in the first place, right? Average is basically sum of the elements divided by the number of elements. So how do I do it? In the question, I need to take a look at every single element. And whenever you are supposed to go through different elements in an array, that's where you use a for loop, right? So my first approach is that I'm definitely going to need a for loop for this question. So I created a for loop, right? Second thing is I need to sum the elements, but I cannot just keep summing them or anything, right? I cannot store the sum in the first place or the second place or the third place. Maybe I should create like a separate integer value to store the sum of those elements, right? I need to store that value as well. So I create an int sum value, and then I keep adding the array values into this sum, right? Last thing is, okay, now I have the sum of the elements. The number of elements, let's assume, has already been given to us in the question, which is value n. So all I have to do is, whatever the sum is, divided by the n value, right? Now my question is, let's say over here we have 5 elements, right? So do you think that this n would be 5 or 4? Now think about this. In the array, the values start at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But their length, when we're talking about the length, it would still be 5 different elements, right? So don't make the mistake of dividing it by 4. It would actually be what the actual length is instead. Okay, so now let's try to figure out what is the time complexity, right? So I hope you understand what exactly is happening. So think about this, right? I've been given an array and the value n, and I'm supposed to do the sum of the elements. In order to do the sum of the elements, I need to approach every single element in the array, right? So I have to start with 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So my point is, let's say if I gave a array of size 10, right? In that case, you would have to sum all those 10 elements. If it's array of size 20, then you would have to go through all those 20 elements. Point is, as n increases, the for loop operation, I should say, the operations inside the for loop would also increase, right? So, and it's increasing proportionally. So think about this. In this case, the time complexity would simply be order of n, right? Why? Because this is growing proportionally with the number of elements I have. If n is 500, my loop would have to go through 500 elements. There's no shortcut way in this part, right? There's no way that I can find some kind of a shortcut to save my time. The sum of the elements is simply that I would have to go through all the elements in order to sum them, right? So I would have to go through all the elements, and that's why the time complexity would be order of n, right? Now, once again, we are not considering exact time that we need. We are considering like a general way to figure out how it grows with the input size. So as the input size n would increase, the time complexity would increase proportionally depending on the value n, right? Okay, now what do you think is the space complexity of this function? Now think about this, right? Okay, so I created this sum integer, right? I created space for it, right? And I created, let's say you already have the other values, right? The array, we don't consider the input and we do not consider whatever the inputs have been basically given, right? So assuming the fact that this and the n value have already been given to us, right? The only single variables that I've created is this sum and this integer I value, right? We don't forget the integer I and the sum. But the point is that these values don't really depend on the input, right? It does not really matter if my input size is 500, 600, or it's something else, right? Int sum would still take the same place. Int I would still take the same amount of place as an integer, right? It's not like they would increase as like the input space in memory would increase as the number of elements increases. These are fixed size, or I should say that they're constant size, right? So in this case, the space complexity would simply be order of 1. Once again, why order of 1? Because we are using constant space. It's not like we are, it's not like it's increasing with the input size. It stays constant along the way, right? So that's one of the questions, and I'll give the code now, and in the next video we will look at another question. Okay guys, let's look at the average code for finding the average of a array of elements. So once again, I've given like a basic description of my code, right? So you can pause the video at any time and read the comments to get a quick overview once again what I've done, right? Okay, so first thing is I've declared the main. Pretty much what I've done is I ask the user to enter the number of elements. So let's say the user enters 5, then my code will basically input 5 different elements, right? So firstly, it will initialize an array of 5 elements, right? So I initialize arrn, meaning array of 5 elements. Secondly, I read the array elements from the user because I want the user to enter the array elements. This is a very simple for loop just for the user to enter the elements, right? And then thirdly, I just calculate the average, right? So average is just basically the sum divided by the number of elements. Lastly, we just print the results, right? So a very simple, very basic code, but once again, I think it forms the core foundation of understanding coding, right? Okay, so I've already made the executable, so I'm just going to execute it. So my code gives me enter the number of elements. I'll just clear it once. Okay, so number of elements is 5. Let's say I enter 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? It sums the elements, number of elements is 5, and the average comes down to 5, basically, right? And that's pretty much it.